Please feel free to join my Discord server to send video requests, chill, and just chat about various different topics. Link is in the description down below, and if you're watching this late, don't worry, I made sure it can't expire. Hope to see you all there. Hello everyone, this is Daikaiju SpaceZilla approaching you, and welcome to yet another episode of Toho Kaiju Marathon. Today, we're gonna take a look at the follow-up to one of the most legendary works of art to ever exist, Godzilla Raids Again. Though I definitely agree with the vast majority of the fandom that in comparison to Godzilla, it falls flat on its ass in nearly all aspects. But we're not measuring dick sizes here. We're nothing more than a group of losers hiding in mommy's basement screaming our opinions on the web like anybody gives a shit. Because let's face it, we don't have anything better to do with our lives. Please kill me, I'm suffering. Way I see it is the Japanese version ain't bad. I'd certainly be disappointed if I was around in the 1950s and went to see this after experiencing Honda's high piece of art, but that doesn't make it less of a solid film in its own right. Anyway, I'm gonna try to avoid getting ahead of myself here and get into the film's history before diving into the movie's overall quality. The tremendous financial success of the original Godzilla made bringing back the monster an easy decision for Toho, and the studio did so the following year. With Ishiro Honda having already moved on to other projects, the director's mantle was passed to Motoyoshi Oda, who had made many Toho program pictures and who worked as a second unit director for Honda's Eagle of the Pacific in 1953. In contrast to Honda's ambitious anti-nuclear cautionary tale, Oda's film is a straight-ahead monster and a loose drama. Godzilla Raids Again would cast actor Hiroshi Koizumi, who becomes a regular in the sci-fi genre later on, along with famous collaborator with Akira Kurosawa Minoru Chiaki, who insisted to take part in Godzilla's sequel after often watching the original be filmed when he was on break from Seven Samurai. Advertising of the film would hype it up to be, quote-unquote, 100 times more interesting than the original. Unfortunately, on its release, it would receive a reputation from critics that has a lot to be desired, pointing out the rushed nature of the overall product, with audiences even today still generally seeing it as one of the lesser additions the series has to offer despite the impact it has on the franchise and the kaiju genre as a whole. Koji Kobayashi is a spotter for a Japanese fishing fleet who crash lands his plane on a barren island. His best friend Shoichi Tsukioka finds him and lands his plane to rescue Kobayashi. The men are shocked to see two giant monsters fighting before falling into the ocean. As they race back to Japan to inform the government what they saw, there's a realization that one monster closely resembles the original Godzilla, and the other monster they dub Angulus looking similar to an Ankylosaurus. Soon, the two monsters arrive in Osaka to resume their battle, so the Japanese government pretty much has to find a way to stop these two giants before they destroy all of Japan. Being a direct continuation in 1954's beloved masterpiece, the bar was set very high for a sequel, with its severely dark and depressing themes throughout its story. Raids Again, though isn't anything silly like some of the entries to come after, the tone has lightened up in comparison and didn't really have any particular message to give the audience. But I'm not some pretentious ass picker under the delusion everything needs to have something to say, okay? I'm someone who's all for the execution of the filmmaker's vision instead of judging by concept alone. What made Godzilla so good wasn't what it had to say. Its message was without a doubt important as hell, but the execution of said message and everything else about it was superb, and that's why Godzilla is so fantastic. It's the execution of the concept, not the concept alone. All that out of the way, I do have my issues with the pacing here. I'm all for taking your time to develop everything, as I'm sure my last episode made that clear as day, but in Raids Again's case, some parts just drag on. A perfect example of this is the scene Dr. Yamane is showing everyone the previous Godzilla's rampage across Japan. I love the 54 classic as much as the next guy, and I appreciate them using footage from it to show everyone how much of a threat the last Godzilla was instead of making new scenes for the sake of consistency. However, did it really need to run on for that length? It just feels like filler, and the lack of audio gets boring rather fast. Also, outside of some pacing problems, a fair share of choices that human beings make are just stupid. Why weren't the prisoners handcuffed? You got a group of bad people in the back of a van with 0 forms of restraints stuck with one officer. I can only guess they were short on cuffs and just stuck the guy they liked the least in the back with them while hoping for the best. But I digress. It may have its shortcomings like most aspects around Raids Again, but it's generally a well-executed story that picks up the events from Godzilla respectfully. Raids Again, due to going for a fairly different tone than 1954, and the audience already being familiar enough with the king, doesn't have as much of an interest in being suspenseful. And I like that. Gives another aspect to distinguish it from Godzilla, and a pretty solid reveal for Godzilla and Anguillus at the first few minutes, with a pleasant surprise for them just showing up out of the blue while everything seems all fine and dandy since Japan believed to be kaiju-free with the prior Godzilla being killed by the oxygen destroyer. Only to find out another Godzilla was created with a new prehistoric beast added to the problem being Anguillus. It's nice they went with a different approach to stop Godzilla instead of doing a copy and paste of the oxygen destroyer or a completely new weapon to kill it either. It took a reasonable strategy for our heroes to find a proper solution since Serizawa and all the info for his destructive invention are gone, so rather than ending this one's life, it takes thinking outside the box a bit. And even then, the strategy just hits them, just by noticing one little thing that could stop him. Some may view this as a lack of development, but me personally, I find this to be great writing, as often in our world, solutions just suddenly hit us at any given time.
Though it's often forgotten about or panned, the story in Godzilla Raids Again isn't as terrible as some would have you believe. It's just that Gojira is a hard act to follow. I'm not the first to say that Raids Again draws some parallels to the second and lesser, but no less terrible, American bombing of Nagasaki, just as Gojira did for Hiroshima. But a more fitting real-life comparison, if we're going to assign one to the film, is that of Godzilla representing America's nuclear threat, while Anguirus represents the Russian nuclear threat, all viewed through the lens of the 1950s phase of the Cold War, with poor Japan caught in the middle, anxiously waiting for a world post the possible nuclear war between the two nations.
The cast of characters are kind of a letdown when you look at the brilliance and memorability of those in its predecessor. The romantic chemistry with Koji Kobayashi and Hidemi Yamaji, played by Minoru Chiaki and Setsuko Wakayama, is honestly adorable and brings a refreshingly sweet taste to the movie for lighthearted effect. That is an overall breath of fresh air after visiting the deep, emotional, and all-around terrifying kaiju flick that was the important piece we know and love. From the performances alone, they're obviously sweet on each other, and words of dialogue had plenty of weight to give off the correct warm feeling it was aiming for.
Kobayashi-san, 変だと思ったらあなたのことなのね、花婿さんって。
おかしな名前もらっちゃったよ。
本当にニックネームだけなの？
うん。僕からのところ。
だらしないの。まだ見つかんないの、花嫁さん。
ここにね、一人。
あら、見せて。
いや、まだその時期に話す。
ずるい人。
But aside from that, what is it you can talk about in terms of them as human beings? Kobayashi's only trait is he's seeking out a bride, and said bride being Hidemi, who's already engaged to his friend Shoichi Tsukioka, played by Hiroshi Koizumi, but also secretly holds feelings towards Kobayashi as well. Which for both relationships, there is an equal amount of care put into the execution of them to come off as believable and heartwarming. But it's like a piece of cardboard covered in icing. It's sweet, but once you eat off all the sugar coating, it's just bland underneath. Then there's Mayuri Makusho as Yasuko Unuya, which really all her traits revolve around her being the radio operator and friend of Hidemi. She's appropriately bubbly, but her charming positive attitude with a love for food isn't enough to make her character stick out much.
そうやかって、そないしないと私ら魚も食べられしませんことになりますわ。
On a lighter note, while the situation of another Godzilla appearing, in addition to another monster in Anguirus, is treated seriously, the cast of Raids Again don't forget to go on living as much as they can in spite of the circumstances. keeping an overall positive attitude that is refreshing after the heavy stakes of Gojira. Concerned with their own personal love lives, the dynamic between Tsukioka, Hidemi, and Kobayashi is charmingly cute, if not a bit on the soap opera side. But much as Spider-Man is a soap opera with superheroes, so too is this particular entry in the Godzilla franchise, and soap operas with superheroes or monsters are the best kind.
Effects-wise shows that it was rushed into production. However, they're still pretty good. But why is it that this Godzilla looks high off his ass? I mean, he looks cool at some shots, even though the design as well as the suit as a whole is admittedly a step down from the last, mainly due to some odd joints that makes it more apparent it's a man in a rubber suit. But it was still impressively detailed. However, his face still looks like he smoked something special in the back with Cheech and Chong before walking onto the set.
Y'all got any more of those Percocets?
Anguillus is my least favorite incarnation of the character yet. No contest. But without this one, we wouldn't have the superior incarnations to come down the road. But let's pretend for a minute that there was no later versions of this iconic monster. How does Anguillus stand as his own beast? He's likable. I wouldn't go as far as saying he's for an ankylosaurus like Godzilla was for theropods, stegosauruses, iguanodons, and an alligator, but it's still a neat design with one of the more memorable roars out of not just the franchise, but monsters in all of cinema. And how the suit was crafted for the time was good. Now the suits featured in the film are solid, but could have been better, even with the era it came out considered. But how about the miniatures? In my humble opinion, the craftsmanship is on par with the fantastic work done in Godzilla from 1954. These are easily where most of the effort came in terms of special effects. There isn't any shots where you can notice people inside them this time, but I'm not gonna fault it for something it doesn't have because I don't think that's fair. They're detailed and nothing looked off about them if you go in with the mindset that's from the early Showa period. You can point and laugh about how ridiculously quick the battles between Godzilla and Anguillus are, but for the first of its kind, it's pretty badass. And it's amazing to see how the iconic kaiju battles the franchise is known for started before it evolved into what we know and love today. Plus, the extremely fast movements and pretty much everything else about how the fights are executed give it a much more tribal and animal-like feel that rarely occurred again afterwards. Really has me thinking that maybe when working on raids again, they studied how actual beasts in nature duke it out with one another, since there wasn't much else to take inspiration from when it came out, with the exception of King Kong versus the Meat Eater.
Raids Again once more features the talents of Eiji Tsuburaya, although to meet the rush deadline of the film's release date, some stock footage from the previous film was used, but this would hardly become a rare occurrence later in the Showa series. That said, what is new here is still solid, albeit a bit surreal thanks to the fights with Godzilla and Anguirus being shot in real time, giving it a raw, animalistic quality. That, or a sped-up effect, not unlike that seen in older silent films. This would be the final Showa appearance of a Godzilla with feline-like ears, as he would take on an earless, more reptilian look for the rest of the Showa series, not getting the ear treatment again until the Heisei series 29 years later. Anguirus also makes a solid debut, with a striking design that's lasted throughout the years, though it would be perfected during his next appearance in Destroy All Monsters.
I'm disappointed to say the soundtrack's not anything that would stick with you after watching the movie, as it's just kinda there. I know Masaru Sato isn't a bad composer. I liked his work in some later Showa movies, and he produced great scores for other groundbreaking films like Yojimbo and The Hidden Fortress. But I found what's offered in Raids Again to be just okay. I do like the opening theme, as it carries a bit of a similar vibe to an Ifukube score that enhanced it considerably. But I think the monster fight scenes needed background music that was on the epic side, like the opening theme, for example. But instead, they carry this grim-sounding stuff that ain't necessarily out of place, but complements an action scene much less than it would if it was used to complement something unsettling like Godzilla's attacks in the previous story. I'm well aware that Godzilla Raids Again steps away from the horror genre, but this trek is under the impression it's going for the same haunting tone as Godzilla when it ain't. Being a romance movie, there is some tracks featured for it, but though they feel like they belong to the scenes for sure, I can't say I found them to be all that either. Most I can give the score is it's better than nothing, but don't expect much.
Masaru Sato makes his musical debut in the Godzilla series with Raids Again, and while not as iconic as his scores for Ebra or Mechagodzilla, it still produces the proper effect. What's more memorable, however, is the moments where things get silent, such as when the Air Force tries to lure Godzilla away from Osaka with flares, the lights agitating him due to their association with the pain of him being bathed in atomic fire. Sato has an ominous, droning musical score accompany this moment at select times throughout, never overusing it and making the scene all the more eerie, and thus probably the most iconic moment of the whole film, aside from the fight that directly follows.
Raids Again deserves more credit than what some fans provide, but I can't say it's a great art piece that rivals the original because that's not even close to the truth. There are far superior additions to the series on both an entertainment scale and a critical one that I watch far more frequently. But aside from Raids Again's shortcomings, it's a solid follow-up to Godzilla that should be viewed by everyone at some point in their lives. I was able to watch it 3 times in a row before doing this review, and it never got old. Each viewing was equally satisfying, so I'm gonna have to award Godzilla Raids Again a good 7 out of 10 stars. It's not great, but a slightly underappreciated gem in the series.
Raids Again is one of only 2 Showa-era Godzilla films to not be directed by either Ishiro Honda or Jun Fukuda, the other being Yoshimitsu Banno's Godzilla vs. Hedorah. Though it was just a quick job for him, I think Motoyoshi Oda's direction imparts just enough style in select moments of Raids Again to make it worthwhile. It is experimental in a lot of cases, particularly in figuring out how exactly it wants to follow up a masterclass in capturing cultural trauma through a cinematic experience, aka Gojira. But Raids Again does take the first step in the direction that I prefer the franchise to follow, that being monster versus monster, with allegory sprinkled in subtly, if there at all. A few of its plot points may be contrived for some fans, such as the prison escape resulting in a crash then fire that leads Godzilla back to the shore of Osaka, but it's not entirely unreflective of the randomness of real life. And the soapy drama may test the patience of action-hungry G-fans, but it's a sweet romance pulled off well through early performances from young actors, some who would soon become Toho regulars like Hiroshi Kazumi, with Yoshio Tsuchiya also popping up in a small role. Godzilla Raids Again isn't one of the best G-films, but it's not a dumpster fire like some make it out to be either, and any newcomers to the franchise should give it at least one watch to make up their own minds. I give it a 4 out of 5.
As much as I wish we were done, God fucking hates me and forced me to suffer through this, so I'm gonna make you suffer with me. This is Gigantus the Fire Monster. Some of the same independent producers behind the highly successful US release of Godzilla King of the Monsters picked up the stateside rights to Raids Again. They originally intended to excise all the dramatic scenes and use the monster footage in an entirely new film with an American cast to be titled The Volcano Monsters. That plan fell through, however, and the film was instead released in 1959 in a severely altered version with Godzilla renamed Gigantus. This poor excuse for an altered version failed in the United States way harder than Raids Again did in Japan. It's not even funny. Whether or not you like the first sequel to Godzilla, it seems most of us can agree that Gigantus is a worthless piece of crap. So much so that even illiterate kids who can't read choose the Japanese version over it because it's just that fucking terrible. I'm not gonna go into this one to the extent I did Godzilla King of the Monsters because though it is heavily altered in its own right, too much of Raids Again is left intact in order to really make this a big segment that might as well be its own video. But then you might be thinking, SpaceZilla, if that much of Godzilla Raids Again remains in this version, why is it so painful to sit through? Oh, you poor, ignorant child. I feel so bad for you. Plot is pretty much the same as it is in the Japanese version. Only stuff is replaced into the script that absolutely nobody asks for, that tries its hardest to distance itself from being a Godzilla film for no apparent reason other than they wanted it to stand on its own. I'm sorry, you're Americanizing a sequel to a Japanese movie. If you want something that could be viewed as a completely new property, 1. Americanize some other poor innocent foreign property that's not tied to anything in particular. Especially Godzilla, you spineless cocksucker. 2. Or better yet, make your own f***ing movie. At least that way you ain't ruining good products, which unfortunately became the norm with these types of edits. There's also this ridiculous narration added that's just unnecessary and offers absolutely nothing to the film. Now I know Godzilla King of the Monsters from 1956 too added narration to a story that originally did not have it, but that is because KOTM had a noir thing going for it, and how the whole thing was handled, it worked. Raids Again just uses it to explain shit from the Japanese story that didn't need it and treats the audience like they're a bunch of flaming retards. Here's the thing, Gigantus. We Americans don't need you to dumb down everything for us by narrating the obvious. We're not complete dumb shits. Well, we do still think the presidential election was stolen and believe a kaiju film can work with no human characters, so never mind, carry on. We also got some weird prehistoric footage from an unknown source before they showed the events of Godzilla, which makes no sense and is just as dragged out as the Godzilla footage, if not more so.
X-ray man filled the air with radiation, which shook these prehistoric monsters from underground. The result was the first Anguirus.
Ah, this is pissing me off. Don't worry, I have no idea why they did this either. But I heard from Steve Rifle on the DVD commentary that it was more than likely from various children education videos at the time. Which is lazy, but better than stealing from something less obscure, as at least nearly, if not everyone viewing this edit, hasn't seen it before. Credit when credit is due, the music and narration does add to it a little more, rather than just a few moments of silence like Raids Again. But it's still f***ing stupid with that being said. The narration also gives the scene an all-around documentary feel to it, which I guess makes sense in the context of the film. Now the cast of this version, I have a bit to say about. Kei Luke's a serviceable voiceover for Shoichi Tsukioka. He's got charisma, but the issue here is he doesn't hold back and just comes off as over the top, which works for the sweet romantic parts, but takes away from scenes that have the intent of being a little darker. I will admit, I was slightly surprised by the fact Hidemi's dub actress actually wasn't awful. Don't get me wrong, she's not good, but the tone she gave off matched the character's writing enough, so I found her to be a passable replacement. But why the fuck does Kobayashi sound like a drunk Yogi Bear?
We are going to transfer all our fishing boats to the Hokkaido front.
Oh, very good, sir. Tsukioka will love the change of scene.
Guess one of them picnic baskets had some booze lying around and he decided to try some.
Hey, Boo-Boo. Let me get another shot of that sockeye before the lizardy guy gets back.
But that's not where the questions end, cause I don't know what daft thought it was a good idea to change Godzilla's, oh wait, I'm sorry, Gigantus, roar to Angulus's, but I hate you and I hope you die. The score is a blend of Raids Again soundtrack, which was okay, but it also throws in music from Kronos alongside the Deer Slayer, both being from 1957. I get they wanted to add more variety to its soundtrack, but at least be creative about it. Not to mention this music it uses is overwhelmingly generic and sounds like every other film score at the time.
There's not a whole lot to say about the Americanized version of Raids Again, other than it's a head-scratcher that's worth riffing on. Sequels were not a common thing for a long time in the movie industry, no matter where they were made in the world. Even with the desire to have Raids Again be treated as its own cinematic entity, its handling is haphazard more often than not, with unnecessary stock footage added, constant narration, and even mismatching of the voices of our starring monsters. Speaking of voices, the dub does feature early work from George Takei, as well as the voices of Key Luke and Paul Frees, though use of the offensive banana oil line, common in dubs of Asian films at the time, is among their scripted lines. For what it's worth, the unmade original version of this film, The Volcano Monsters, which would have used the suits of Godzilla and Anguirus and had its own original story, sounded like it would have been much better. But we have the loss of the monster suits while in transit to blame for why it never came to be. For more detailed thoughts on various changes to Raids Again in becoming Gigantus, I recommend the channel of Paper Fins.
At the end of the day, Gigantus is a total disaster that butchers Godzilla Raids Again. Which wasn't a great film, mind you, but it didn't deserve this shit! This movie is a painful experience, and I despise every second watching it for this fucking review alone. Yes, it's that bad. I do not recommend this film at all. Even if you like dub, please don't torture yourself with this. It ain't worth it. Just fucking don't. Only thing I can give it is it does keep some aspects Raids Again did right left intact without fucking them up, and it's a little tighter paced than the Japanese one. Even though I hate to give it that much credit, but it's true. It shaved off some unnecessary filler, and I do appreciate that. But in all other aspects, definitely skip this mess. It's a miserable experience that I don't know how I was able to tolerate, even as a stupid kid. But I ranted enough to get my point across, so I'm gonna give it a 3 out of 10 stars. And that's only for the few positives I mentioned earlier, which you can mainly get from the Japanese version with the exception of the smoother pace. Anyway, that was it for this episode. If you liked this video, please hit that like button, share it around, and subscribe. Please make sure to hit that bell for notifications to keep up to date on all my future content, along with going and checking me out on social media. Also, go and subscribe to my boy Trevor Thomson. He's a great friend of mine who I always have a blast collaborating with. This is Daikaiju SpaceZilla, leaving the building.